I'm making a game. As the Day Turns is going to be a game about a jacked swordsman who has a giant sword. And no, his name is not Guts. I'm Shaggles, and I'm a solo dev who released a game called The Abyss last year, which sold around 200 copies, which honestly I'm pretty proud of. And I just finished up another project called Eclipse, which will be releasing this September. Now I've started working on my biggest project yet, As the Day Turns. I'm actually almost caught up reading Berserk right now, and so far it's been absolutely amazing. One of my favorite stories of all time. So of course the main character is going to be a guy swinging around a sword that's double his size. And he's also going to be as jacked as I can possibly make a pixel be. The only issue with it is that when I was trying to develop both the Abyss and Eclipse, I actually tried to do melee combat and I was too ass at game dev. So hopefully I'm a little bit better at it now and I can actually make these systems work. I also want this game to be incredibly dark and well thought out when it comes to the story. So I actually have a draft of the entire story done out, which of course I'm not going to be showcasing now, I want it to be a surprise, kind of like early Christmas gifts or waking up to the Berlin Wall. Anyway, let's break down how the character works. So first off, one of the biggest issues with Construct 3 as a platform to develop games is the sprite editor has absolutely no layer system. So instead, I decided to build my character like a Lego. I started by making a base object that will control all of the character states for the game, from collisions to movement, and then I made separate body pieces for the player character, like his body and head, 2 separate arms, and then his legs, as well as his massive sword. I also did some basic prototype animations for each of these pieces. Now that I have the character pieces, I pinned them all to the main character controller and set up the basic movement and animation code. And I added both a ground and platform object that the player can actually walk around on and whatnot. So since I'm planning on making this game a Souls-like, because I love Souls-likes, I need a really rock-solid foundation for the combat system. So here are some of the key points of what I'm going to be having in this game for the combat. First, I'm going to need a combo system. Next, I'll need a parrying system, then I'll need a health and stamina system, and then lastly, I'm making a system called the frenzy system. So first, the actual attacking and comboing system. I started by making 3 separate swing animations for the greatsword as well as the player model. This is one of the biggest reasons I actually decided to break the player model up into separate pieces, as it allowed me to have the leg and body pieces still play like running animations, while the sword and arms are playing the attack animations, allowing for a more fluid feeling with the combat system, kind of similar to how Hollow Knight does their system. This will also be further built upon when using the frenzy system. Now that I have some animations to go off of, I made it so that when the player swings a sword, it actually lingers on that last frame for a little bit longer, allowing them to either continue the combo chain or to wait. And then after the player sheathes the sword on their back, they also still have a limited time frame to attack again before that combo ends and starts with the first animation again. Now, something that every Souls-like indie game ever has decided to use to be able to brand themselves as a Souls-like is a dodge mechanic. And I did that too for 2 games already, so I wanted to do something a little bit different. Instead of using a dodge mechanic, this game's all about parrying. There's no dodge at all. To make this viable, I wanted to make sure that the parry system was very similar to Sekiro's, where if you press the parry button, your player immediately parries the oncoming attack. So that's exactly what I did. As long as the player is playing this parry animation, the oncoming attack will not hurt you and will actually be able to stun an enemy or stagger them a little bit. Or at least that's the hope for now. I haven't made any of the enemies yet. Now next, I made a health and stamina system, which is currently very bare bones and basically just has some cool looking green and red bars that go down when the player swings their sword or attempts to parry. I also made sure that the player is unable to either attack or attempt to parry if they don't have the required amount of stamina available to them. So that's pretty much all I have for that so far. Now on to the most unique mechanic I've made, probably ever, the frenzy system. So this is probably going to be one of the most complicated systems in the entire game, as based on a hidden meter that I'm calling the frenzy meter, the gameplay and the combat system will change very drastically. So this hidden meter will be determined by different factors like the amount of enemies that are surrounding the player, the amount of health the player currently has, the amount of frantic button mashing the player is doing, as well as where the character's mindset is at in the story at that point. This whole mechanic is based around the idea of immersing the player further into the actual character that they're playing as. So if the player is playing frantically, it will reflect on the character in game. So some examples of this is when the hidden frenzy meter is actually low, the player will attack much slower and have a much larger parry window. Whereas when they are more frenzied, their attacks will be much faster with a way more limited parry window. Now the way I actually achieved this is by breaking down the meter into 3 separate states: a calm state, a neutral state, and a frenzied state. While in the calm state, the player has slower animation and movement speed, all across the board, which makes the attacks feel a lot slower and more calculated, as well as they move slower. Now, this also makes it so that their parry window is a lot longer than if you're frenzied. I also made it so they have a reduced amount of stamina consumption for attacking and parrying. Now, when you get to the frenzied state, the player actually moves a lot faster and has a much faster animation speed. To kind of balance this out a little bit, they consume a much larger amount of stamina per everything they do. The reason I did this was because I wanted to make the player feel a little bit more immersed in their character. If you're playing super frantic, your character's going to be just as frantic. I also have lots of plans for this mechanic to kind of tie into the game's story segments, and of course, after I release the game, if it's a really good mechanic that everyone loves and would love to see in every game for the rest of ever, I'm planning on patenting it and then never using it again. Alright, now to do some touch-ups to make the game feel a little bit better. So first off, I need to make the combat feel a little bit more weighty, because it just looks like you're swinging around something. So I found some solid sword swinging sound effects and heavily edited them to make them sound like a heap of raw iron is actually swinging through the air. I also made it so that the screen shakes a little bit when the player actually swings their sword, as it's huge. To make some of the swinging feel a little bit better, I also made it so that the player swings towards whatever side the mouse is on, so even if the player is running to the left, they can still swing their sword to the right, which I'm hoping will make the combat feel a lot more fair than if I had it what I was originally doing, where you would swing whatever side you were looking to. Here's a little game dev secret. If it's ugly, you want to cover it with more ugly until it's kind of less ugly. So, something that I did, I actually made some of this animated grass tile sheets that I can throw on top of the ground to make it look way less ugly, while also hiding the player's ugly legs. I heard some game dev somewhere deem these to be called beautifiers. I don't remember who or where, but I saw it, so that's what I'm going to be calling them for the rest of the series. If I ever figure out who it was, I'll link them somewhere. I also made some simple rocks that can be used as beautifiers for like the sides of walls and stuff. Just kind of makes it look a little bit better. Next, I made some simple tree backgrounds to simulate running through a forest, because there's going to be a forest in the game, because there's a forest in every fantasy game. This actually makes the background look way less ugly in my opinion. I also added a big red sun in the sky, because in every game I've ever made, I make the central plot revolve around a big red object that ominously floats in the sky. I don't know why, I just think it looks cool, and then I write the story around it usually, but this game it's going to be a big red sun. The last artsy thing I did was actually make these semi-randomly generated trees that I've thrown onto the game layer. The way that these works is I actually have stumps that I manually place into the game, and then on the layout starting, it will randomly select an animation to play for the stump. They're not actually animated, it's just how it selects what object to spawn everything in. And then I also randomly select the scale for these stumps. Next, each stump throughout the layout will spawn leaves that match the stump animation that it's on, and they actually are animated, and then they also adjust their scale accordingly. And then this gets some randomly generated trees, which kind of makes it a little bit spooky, because every time you go into this area, the trees are kind of moving around, which has lore implications. I also added a small fade-in animation for when the level first opens, and a barely noticeable noise filter, because, like I said, adding ugly onto ugly makes it a little bit less ugly, and it gives a bit of a more like dreamlike vibe, kind of like Silent Hill style stuff. Thank you all for sticking around to the end. Let me know what's your favorite Souls-like weapon in the comments below, and if you want to follow along my journey, then make sure to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell. Thank you.